I've really, truly been deeply affected by Richard Rothstein's book. This book truly opened my eyes to the absolute crisis of housing segregation that grips our communities. And it provides an understanding of racial segregation, not only in housing, but in so many areas of life. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Vicki Bean, who will be interviewing Richard tonight. Vicki is the Boxer Family Professor of Law at NYU School of Law from 2014 to 2017. She was the Commissioner of Housing Preservation and Development for the City of New York. Vicki is truly the perfect person to lead this discussion.
So I have had the pleasure of knowing Richard for, I think, more than a decade. But I knew him as just an amazing thinker on education policy. But of course, you can't think about the quality of education, and you can't think about our segregated schools without thinking about our segregated neighborhoods. And unfortunately, not enough people make the connection between those and work across both fields. And I think one of Richard's just incredible contributions here is to connect those two fields and to make the connection between them so very real. So I am not so much interviewing Richard as sort of prompting him, because Richard has so much to say and so many incredibly important points to make that I'm just going to nudge it along a little bit. I wondered if we could start by talking about what's the gap that you saw in a vast literature about our segregated history and the reasons for segregation, and what is it that you were trying to fill? What gap were you trying to fill with this book?
Well, Vicki, that's many questions.
Yep.
So I'm going to start. Let me start by what motivated me, because it relates to what you were saying a minute ago. Is you mentioned I used to think only about education problems of American education, and the biggest problem in American education that policymakers are concerned about and have been concerned about is the achievement gap between disadvantaged children and middle-class children, between black children and white children. And I wrote, as you may have read, many articles, and indeed some books, we won't argue about counting them, but some books explaining what the pathways are between the social and economic conditions that depress student achievement and the achievement gap. And since we're talking some about health, I'll give you an example. I wrote, I think, in the New York Times about asthma. Well, African American children in disadvantaged neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of white children, white middle class children. Now, if you have a child with asthma, that child is likely to come to school drowsy or sleepless, or maybe even be absent from lack of sleep. And of course, there's a distribution of outcomes for every human characteristic, and that's something we always have to emphasize. So that there are some children with asthma who will always achieve at high levels, and some children without asthma who will achieve at low levels. But if you take two groups of children who are equal in every respect, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that first group is going to have lower average achievement with the best instruction and the best schools and the highest expectations and so forth. So, and there are dozens and dozens of these characteristics that I wrote about. And then I began to realize, it took me a while, I'm a slow learner, but it took me a while to realize that you can have a child with asthma who comes to school drowsy, and the teacher can give the child special attention, and maybe the child will do better than he or she otherwise would have without that special attention. But if you concentrate children with asthma in single schools, along with children with many, many other social and economic disadvantages, whether it's coming to school with stress from unemployment in the family and economic insecurity, or whether it's the lack of access to high-quality early childhood programs, any of these things. You concentrate them all in single schools, well, by definition, every child can't get special attention. So in those schools, achievement is inevitably lower. Instruction is likely to be more remedial. Children coming to school with stress, and there's been a lot of research in the last decade since I wrote about this, about the biochemical pathways by which stress translates into lower achievement. So you concentrate those children, and you get lower achievement. Well, we call concentrated schools with these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. We have more segregation in schools, more school segregation today than any other time in the past, outside the South, where you had legal segregation. And the reason is that the schools are located in segregated neighborhoods. And if children go to school in their neighborhood, they're going to go to a segregated school. And then I read and this will get to the second part of your question. Then, because I was interested in education, I read the Supreme Court decision in 2007 about two school districts, one in Louisville, Kentucky, and the other in Seattle, Washington, which attempted to do very, very token, almost trivial school integration plans to try to overcome some of these problems. And in both districts, they gave parents a choice of where to go to school, where their children could go to school, their high school students. And but the school districts gave some weight to a child's race in those choices to help desegregate the schools in a very, very tiny way. So if you had a school that was mostly white and there was one space left, and both a black child and a white child applied for it, the black child would be given some preference in order to integrate the school. Trivial program. Most children don't apply to school outside their neighborhoods anyway. And the number of situations where there's only one place left and you have to choose between two children is tiny. So it's a very but the Supreme Court said you couldn't do it. And they said you couldn't do it because, and this was the plurality opinion written by Chief Justice Roberts, he said that you couldn't take race into account in assigning children to schools. It would violate the Constitution because schools were segregated de facto. And I think we've all heard that term. It's a national consensus that we have de facto segregation. And de facto segregation is the result of private prejudice or real estate agents, rogue real estate agents who are steering white families to white neighborhoods and black families to black neighborhoods, or perhaps people's choices of wanting to live with others, same race as others, or maybe because African Americans had incomes that weren't adequate to buy homes in middle-class neighborhoods. All these personal factors, not government involvement, and if you have de facto segregation, there's no permissible remedy. Well, that wasn't surprising from Chief Justice Roberts, but what stunned me was the dissent from Associate Justice Stephen Breyer, the liberal justice, agreed with Chief Justice Roberts that we had de facto segregation in Louisville and Seattle that was not subject to remediation. And Breyer's dissent was based on the claim that if you have de facto segregation, you should be permitted to integrate even though you can't be compelled to. And I remembered reading about a case in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the cities that was subject to this Supreme Court case in the 1950s, where a white family sold a home to an African American Navy veteran. A mob surrounded the home. They firebombed it. And the state of Kentucky arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and jailed the white seller for sedition. And so I said to myself, this doesn't sound much like de facto segregation. And so I began to wonder whether there was more to it than just an isolated example of the state using its power to punish a white seller. And I began to look into the history of how neighborhoods came to be segregated. And as you said, there's very little in this book that hasn't been written before. Kenneth Jackson's book, Crabgrass Frontier, Massey and Denton wrote a book called American Apartheid. Much of this has been reported before. And I think, though, that what I tried to do, which I don't think has been done too often before, although it's been done a little bit, is bring together all of these different aspects, these different government programs that explicitly, openly segregated neighborhoods. And I came to the conclusion that racial segregation is not de facto. Racial segregation in every metropolitan area of the country is not de facto, it's de jure. It's the product of unconstitutional government law and public policy that was explicitly designed, openly designed, in writing, to segregate metropolitan areas. It says the racial boundaries of our metropolitan areas are as unconstitutional as school segregation was before 1954, or requiring African Americans to sit in back of buses was before the 1960s. It's an unconstitutional system, but unlike all of these other unconstitutional segregation systems, we never remedied it because we're befuddled by this myth of de facto segregation. So that's how I came to it, and it came from education.
But I also want to point out that not only is one of your major, is one of your major contributions to pull it all together and show the pervasiveness, but also to show it's not just the federal government, it's not just the state government, it's not just the local governments, it's everybody, all governments acting together. I also think that one of the things that's so powerful about your book and what makes it resonate in a way that some of the prior literature had not is the way that you personalize it. You use a particular family, Frank Stevenson. You use a variety of families, but you start with Frank Stevenson and follow him all the way through, and then talk about the legacy that this has left for his grandchildren. So I wondered if you could tell us, how did you pick Frank Stevenson to focus on, and what was your thinking in terms of making it so personal?
I've written several books, we won't count them, in the past, which were basically oriented towards policymakers and the policy community. I wanted to write a book that would be a more popular book, that would somehow inform the public, the informed public, the literate public, about the myth of the jury segregate, the myth of de facto segregation. And one of the ways you write journalistic history is by picking individuals. And I can talk a little bit about Frank Stevenson, how I picked him. I wanted in this book, in picking stories, and I tried to sample them from around the country, but I particularly wanted to emphasize the places in the country that are known to be more liberal than others. And because I thought that if I could show people how the government explicitly segregated liberal areas like San Francisco or Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example, that it would be easier for them to understand that if it happened there, it happened everywhere. So I read an oral history that had been done of in Richmond, California, which is part of the San Francisco Bay Area. It's across the bay from San Francisco, of Frank Stevenson. And it didn't focus on this aspect. So reading this history, I tracked him down. He was still alive at the time. He died about a year and a half ago. And interviewed him at length on a number of occasions, and wrote his story as it affects this. And I can tell that story if you like. Well, Frank Stevenson, an African-American migrant from Louisiana during World War II, thousands and thousands of African-American, hundreds of thousands of workers, both whites and blacks, migrated to centers of war production during World War II. It was after the Depression. People needed jobs. The only jobs that were being created at that time were in war industries, and so hundreds of thousands of workers migrated to centers of war production. And Richmond, in the San Francisco Bay Area, was one of them. It was a shipbuilding center. It was where the Kaiser shipyards were turning out Liberty ships. Frank Stevenson was one of those migrants. He came to Richmond during World War II. He got a job at a Ford motor plant, which was also in Richmond, along the docks in Richmond, that was turning out jeeps and tanks for the war effort. And at the end of World War II, the plant reverted to automobile production. It was a Ford motor plant. It didn't, by the way, it would not hire African Americans before the war, but during the war, the government demanded that the production lines keep moving, and when they ran out of white workers, they hired African Americans. And so the sign in front of the Ford plant saying that the Mexicans and Negroes not wanted came down, and they hired people like Frank Stevenson. In the 1950s, plants like the Ford plant became technologically obsolete because the Ford plant was on, as I say, it was in along the San Francisco Bay, because automobile plants needed to be at deep water ports so that they could get supplies from ships. Because space was scarce along the ocean there, the bay, they were multi-story plants, and the parts were delivered by elevator from one. Wasn't a continuous assembly line. But as the interstate highway system came to be built, and highways and trucking became a more feasible way of delivering parts and shipping finished automobiles, plants like this one, and you know the story of industry all over the country, could move out to rural areas. And so this plant moved out, the Ford plant closed in Richmond and moved to a rural area called Milpitas, which is part of what we now know as Silicon Valley. At that time it was rural. And the United Auto Workers negotiated an agreement with Ford that permitted, in the meantime it had been organized by the United Auto Workers, and a negotiated agreement with Ford that permitted all the workers in the Ford plant in Richmond to keep their jobs and move to Milpitas. But the white workers could move, and the African Americans like Frank Stevenson couldn't. The reason was that during this period, the Federal Housing Administration was financing suburbs all over the country. I'm not referring to, it's well known that the Federal Housing Administration redlined urban areas. That is, it refused to guarantee mortgages or insure mortgages to African Americans in African American neighborhoods. But a far more powerful policy and program of the Federal Housing Administration was not just the individual insurance of single mortgages, but the subsidization of mass production builders all across the country to build entire suburbs on condition that they be for whites only. On explicit condition. Not that, it wasn't the unintended consequence of neutral economic policies. It's not that only whites happen to apply to live in these suburbs. Right. There was an explicit policy of the Federal Housing Administration that only whites could live in suburban areas, and the most famous one here in New York is Levittown, east of the city in Nassau County, and Levittown. William Levitt. I'm straying a little bit, but this is necessary to understand what happened to Frank Stevenson. William Levitt could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers. Builders in the past had been building one or two homes and on specs from buyers who wanted to live in them. Levitt could never have assembled the capital to build these homes. The only way he could assemble the capital, and the only way developers in the Milpitas area, where the Ford plant had located to, could develop this capital was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting his plans, in the case of Levitt, his plans for the development, the architecture, the plans for the homes. They were very modest, inexpensive homes, 750 square feet. They sold for about $7,000 or $8,000 in those days. It's about $80,000, $90,000 today. Submitting those plans to the FHA, and the FHA, if it approved those plans, would then give the builder a guarantee that it would insure any mortgages for buyers who bought those homes without any further inspection or qualifications. And the Levitt could then, and the builders in Milpitas and elsewhere in the country, could take those guarantees to banks and get the loans to build developments. And a condition that the FHA put on these developments is that no homes be sold to African Americans. And this was not, as I say, it was not it's not because Levitt was prejudiced. Levitt was prejudiced, but it didn't matter. If the FHA had made a condition that homes be open to all Americans, regardless of his prejudice, Levitt would have had to sell to all Americans. But the FHA put an opposite condition. It even put a condition on the guarantee it gave to Levitt and to all of these other builders that each deed in the home had to include a clause that prohibited either resale or rental to African Americans. So this is how the entire country became suburbanized. The mass Los Angeles became the symbol of mass suburbanization in the 1950s. Well, Lakewood's south of Los Angeles. This was an FHA development. African Americans not permitted to buy. Panorama City in the San Fernando Valley, another one. In San Francisco, my favorite place to talk about because it's considered to be so liberal. Well, some of you may remember Pete Seeger used to sing a song that was written by Malvina Reynolds, and she wrote the song as she was driving by a development, the song about houses on a hillside made of ticky-tacky and they all look the same. Well, this was a song written about a community south of San Francisco in Daly City, also an FHA development with a requirement that no homes be sold to African Americans. So I'll just finish with the Frank Stevenson, which you asked. So Frank Stevenson was unable to move to any of the suburbs that were being created around Milpitas. He wound up having to live his entire life in Richmond, which had become and I could explain that as well later, but had become an all African American community. He kept his job, unlike most African Americans who worked in the plant, by getting together with 8 other workers and buying a van, and they commuted 100 miles each day to be able to get to their jobs in Milpitas. Most workers couldn't do that, and his children, as you say, grew up in a segregated community in Richmond, California, with the schools that were inferior to the schools in the white communities surrounding Richmond, and their outcomes were less than they would have been had Frank and his fellow African Americans who worked in the Ford plant been permitted by the federal government to live amongst white workers.
So, and I urge all of you to, obviously to read the entire book, but one of the things that's so powerful about that story is the way that Richard weaves it through every aspect of the kinds of discrimination and the kinds of de jure policies and laws that were at issue, and also shows how even people with good intentions, one of the most heartbreaking parts of the book is hearing about people who wanted to build housing that near the plant so that African Americans could live there, and fought so hard only to have the FHA say absolutely not, right? And the involvement of the unions. It's a really quite heartbreaking story, but also the fact that you show, well, what if Frank Stevenson, who after all is doing an essential job for the war effort and all that, what if he could have bought a home at that time, how much more wealth his kids and his grandchildren would have, and how different their outcomes might have been. Now, one of the things that's really striking about this story, among other things, is that, well, let me back up for a minute. Those of you who have had the pleasure of going to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington know that one of the first sets of exhibits when you start that journey is showing the way in which the narrative was shaped to say these people are different. These people are different in all of these ways, and therefore to dehumanize and justify the differences in treatment. And so I wonder, as you saw this wide variety of policies and practices and laws, did you also see the shaping of that narrative to justify what people were doing, or did they not need justification?
Well, that's very interesting. In many cases, the federal government, I talked about the suburbanization, but prior to that, the federal government enacted a variety of policies, and as you mentioned, it wasn't just the federal, it was state and local policies as well, but the federal government enacted policies to segregate communities that hadn't been segregated before. Because in the early and even up until part of the mid-20th century, there were many, many integrated neighborhoods in urban areas, many more integrated neighborhoods than we know today. We wouldn't recognize our urban areas if we could go back to the early 20th century with the degree of integration that there was, because workers didn't have automobiles. And so if they worked in a downtown plant, which is where most of the plants were located, like the Ford plant, if they worked in Richmond, if they worked in a plant, they had to be able to walk to work. And so if you had a factory in a center of a city, which employed Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants, or Polish immigrants, or Jewish immigrants, and African Americans. They all had to live close enough to work, so these were integrated neighborhoods. I talk in the book, as you may recall, about I know most of you are lawyers, but maybe some of you read literature too, I don't know. But in any event, there's a great American novelist, Wallace Stegner, whom some of you may have read. He won a Pulitzer Prize for a book, Angle of Repose. But prior to that, I'm straying a little bit. I'll tell this story, and then I'll go back to the story I meant to tell. I get my novelists confused sometimes. Wallace Stegner wrote a well-received novel, autobiographical novel in the 1930s called Big Rock Candy Mountain. And on the basis of that, he was recruited to teach at Stanford University. I was thinking about this because it related to something you said before. And there was a big housing shortage, as I said, at that time, because no housing had been built during the Depression, and during the war, construction materials weren't permitted to be used for civilian construction, enormous housing shortage. And Wallace Stegner came to Stanford, and at the time, Stanford professors were working class people. They weren't paid the unconscionable, exorbitant salaries that they're paid today, like lawyers or other people. And so Wallace Stegner helped to organize a cooperative of 150 families in the Palo Alto area to buy a large ranch outside Stanford University. And on that ranch, they started to build 400 homes they hired an architect, they had the construction beginning, but they couldn't get bank loans to proceed with the construction. The reason they couldn't get bank loans is because the Federal Housing Administration denied the banks the insurance that they required in order to extend the loans, and the FHA denied the banks the authority to issue these loans because 3 members of this 150-member cooperative were African American. And the cooperative eventually disbanded because they couldn't proceed. They were unwilling to expel the 3 families, which was what the FHA required before they could proceed. And the development was sold to a private developer who built an FHA development that excluded African Americans, that had restrictive covenants in the deeds of every home. I don't know, then you graduated from Stanford? Or go to school at Stanford? No. Well, the development is called Ladera, and it was just outside Stanford. Well, the other novelist I was going to talk about to get to this question was Langston Hughes, who in his autobiography, The Big C, described how he grew up in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood in the early 20th century. He says that his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. This was typical of urban areas at the time. The Public Works Administration, one of the first agencies of the New Deal, came into that neighborhood, demolished integrated housing, and built 2 separate public housing projects for workers who needed housing. These weren't poor people. When public housing began, I know we all have an image of public housing. Public housing was not for poor people. Public housing was for working class families who could pay the cost of the housing and their rents. There were no subsidies involved. The Public Works Administration built segregated housing in this Cleveland neighborhood, 1 project for African Americans, a separate project for whites, creating segregation where it had never been known before. And this happened across the country. Well, I mentioned before Cambridge, Massachusetts, I like to talk about. Cambridge, some of you went to school in Cambridge, I imagine. The Central Square area in the 1930s was an integrated area, about half black and half white. The Public Works Administration demolished that area and built separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation which had never before existed. And in terms of the question you're asking, creating the concept in people's minds that segregation was the natural way of being, did so. I mean, if the Public Works Administration had simply followed an opposite policy, a constitutional policy, of building integrated housing, nothing prevented it from doing so. If they needed public housing, workers were used to living amongst one another. I'm not saying that in these integrated neighborhoods every other home was an African American, but people were used to integration. If the Public Works Administration had simply built integrated housing in the 1930s, different patterns would have been established in every city in the country. Of course, there would have been some segregation, but different patterns would have been, and this country would look entirely different today.
And the book recounts not only that the WPA was building the segregated public housing, but also that they refused to allow their own workers to live in integration, right? That they built separate barracks for the WPA workers who were white and those who were black. It's really quite startling. So let's turn though. I mean, so you've talked a little bit about public housing, and that being certainly one of the foundational aspects of the kind of segregation that is building based upon all of these different approaches. But at the same time, we were starting to see the influence of zoning, right? Of course, the zoning was upheld in 1926 against the lower court opinion that said this is about race. What this zoning ordinance is doing is segregating by race, and nevertheless was upheld. Now, explicit racial zoning, of course, was struck down, although we still have certainly exclusionary zoning, and we have many zoning actions that are what we call today expulsive zoning. But can you talk a little bit, and I think one of the interesting things here is how the judicial decision striking down explicit racial zoning then bubbled out or led to all of these other strategies, really, they're alternative strategies, once that explicit strategy was taken off the table.
Sure. In the first couple of decades of the 20th century, a number of cities adopted explicit zoning rules because they were integrated, and this was the era. I know that we've been hearing a lot about this lately, where it's a wonderful thing. We're starting to talk about aspects of our racial history that have been talked about before, but it's now becoming more widely known that we had much more racial progress in this country in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and then a reaction set in, and the Jim Crow era evolved. And one of the aspects of the Jim Crow era was that cities that had many integrated neighborhoods began to pass laws attempting to segregate them. And typically the laws, Baltimore was the first one to do it in 1910, and the laws typically said that you couldn't move onto a block where a majority of people were of a different race. Obviously, the law would have been meaningless if there weren't all these integrated blocks in Baltimore. In fact, they had very great difficulty enforcing the ordinance because they came up with situations like there was a parish on one block, and the priest died, and the bishop appointed a new priest. But the new priest was white. A white priest died. The bishop appointed a new priest, but the priest couldn't move into the parsonage because the block was majority black. And so they had to keep on revising the ordinance, and finally they made the ordinance had to be all black to prohibit a white from moving onto it, or had to be all white to prohibit a black from moving on. So there were these ordinances, and in 1917, the Supreme Court declared those ordinances unconstitutional. It actually, interestingly enough, it was in a case involving Louisville, Kentucky. But the Supreme Court declared those ordinances unconstitutional, not for racial reasons. Those of you who, you might not know too much about literature, but some lawyers know about the Supreme Court history, and you know that at that time the Supreme Court was enamored of the idea that the 14th Amendment existed to protect property rights. And these zoning ordinances were thought of as being what they were. They interfered with a homeowner's property right to sell or rent to anybody he wanted. So a zoning ordinance that said that you couldn't sell to someone of an opposite race or rent to somebody of the opposite race from the majority of the block would have violated the homeowner's property rights, and it was declared unconstitutional. And that was 1917. And immediately after that, there became an enormous interest across the country in zoning ordinances that weren't explicitly racial, but that could accomplish the same thing. In 1920, after World War I, 3 years after this decision, and by the way, this decision is the 100th anniversary of that decision. But in 1920, Warren Harding was elected president, and he appointed as his Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover formed a committee on zoning, which was made up of planners who explicitly said that we need to develop economic zoning to prevent racial mixing. And some of the people on the committee were people who had actually designed the ordinances that had just been declared unconstitutional. So they explicitly said that they wanted this zoning model to replace racial zoning and to accomplish the same thing without naming race that the Supreme Court said they couldn't do. And so they developed a pamphlet, a primer on zoning. It was distributed to officials in every city and suburb in the country. And gradually, over the course of the 1920s, municipalities, jurisdictions adopted zoning ordinances that segregated the population by economic status. With the intent, as you said, it was the case that eventually came to the Supreme Court in 1926 was in Ohio, a neighborhood near Cleveland, that adopted a zoning ordinance, and the lower court said that it's clear that this is this zoning ordinance is designed to prevent colored people and foreigners from moving into a neighborhood in violation of the 1917 decision. And so zoning across the country became adopted by municipalities. The municipalities didn't need to have racial motivation, although many of them did. And there were lots of court cases that had racial motivation. In 1926, though, the Supreme Court said it was okay to do zoning of this kind. And the interesting thing is that, so far as I know, and I am not a lawyer, but so far as I know, this 1926 decision that upheld the right of municipalities to zone, to tell people what they could do with their property, is the only case in which the Supreme Court interfered with property rights in the 20 or so 30-year period between the beginning of the 20th century and 1938, when a switch in time saved 9.
Right.
So this is the only case, and as a result, we have exclusionary zoning in many suburbs in the country that prohibit the construction of single-family homes on small lot sizes, or townhouses, or apartment buildings, and it's a way of keeping out lower-income families, particularly African-American and now increasingly Hispanic families.
Right. And Justice Sutherland, who was the author of the Euclid opinion, of course, had been the author of most of those other cases, striking down fair labor standards, wage and hour standards as being a violation of property rights. So it was quite a remarkable shift, but also shows the narrative, the use of narrative, right? Because he talked about the multifamily houses that poorer people lived in as being parasitic on the single-family homes and interfering with their property values. But of course, over the ensuing years since 1926, there are many, many things that you talk about outside of zoning, the kinds of things that so we're now turning to local governments, state and local governments really, that went beyond zoning. So do you want to talk for a minute about those?
Well, sure. There were many policies that reinforced the federal policies of creating segregation, all of which violated the Constitution, violated the 14th, and I suggest in the book the 13th and the 5th Amendments to the Constitution. Let me start with the most trivial one that I talk about in the book to show how at what low level it goes, and then we can talk going up a bit. In the course of doing this research, I was reading an African-American newspaper from the 1940s in Los Angeles called The Eagle. And The Eagle had an article in it in which it described something that happened in Culver City, California. Culver City was a white suburb of Los Angeles. We know it today as a place where movies are made. Movie studios are located. But Culver City, Los Angeles. Now, at the time, this was during World War II, and at the time, both the East and the West Coasts had civil defense systems, which included air raid wardens who went door to door telling people to turn down their lights and close their blackout curtains so as not to give guidance to Japanese bombers or to German bombers on the East Coast. And my father was one of them. He was a civil defense warden and had a fancy helmet that he wore when he went door to door telling people to turn off their lights. The city attorney of Culver City convened a meeting of all the air raid wardens in Culver City and instructed them that when they went door to door telling people to dim their lights and making sure that they had closed their blackout curtains, that they also signed and kept up to date the restrictive covenants for that community, promising and pledging never to sell or rent a home to an African American. This was state action. This was the city attorney, the agent of the city of Culver City, was enforcing these allegedly private agreements to restrict. So that's a very, very local level. At the state level, I make an argument which I think not all lawyers would agree with, but I think it's solid, and I think I can persuade you that this argument is solid. The National Association of Real Estate Boards had a code of ethics that prohibited real estate brokers from selling homes in white neighborhoods to African American families. This was a principle of its code of ethics. It was adopted in 1924 and enforced for the next 3 decades. We think of real estate agents who steer white families to white neighborhoods or refuse to sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. We think of them as being private actors, as being a component of de facto segregation. But every one of those real estate agents and real estate brokers was licensed by a state licensing authority. And this was not the rogue action. These practices of real estate were not the rogue action of real estate agents. This was the official policy of the real estate industry. And I argue in the book that every state licensing agency that licensed a real estate agent who was, or broker, who was bound to subscribe to this code of ethics was violating the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And it wouldn't have taken much. You know, this is what's so astounding about this whole history. It wouldn't have taken much. All it would have taken was a state licensing board lifting the licenses of a couple of real estate agents, and the practice would have ended. Instead, real estate agents openly discriminated. They placed their ads in newspapers saying that they were for whites only. It was more explicit than just steering, and they continued to hold their licenses in spite of their open practice of racial discrimination and their code of ethics that they had to subscribe to, pledging to segregate. Let me give you another example of. No, go on. Do you want to ask something?
No, I was going to. I want to leave some time for questions, but I also really want to get to one of the I think most powerful. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting. One of the most powerful parts of the book is really the connections that you draw by saying, look, all of these things added on top of each other, all of these things had a supplementary system, which was to, at the same time, make sure that African Americans could not earn enough money, that even if they could escape the class barrier, barriers, they still couldn't escape the racial barriers. And so I really want to allow you to get to that point.
Well, I deliberated for a while whether to include this in the book because the book is about housing policy, but I had to include this because one of the key explanations for de facto segregation is that African Americans don't have enough income to move to white neighborhoods. And so while the book isn't primarily about federal policy to unconstitutionally depress African American incomes, I have devoted a chapter to it. In 1934-35, Senator Wagner of New York sponsored a bill creating the National Labor Relations Act. The National Labor Relations Act provided for federal government certification of unions, and once unions received that certification, they had exclusive bargaining rights with the employer of their members, and this was particularly powerful in the construction industry because unlike the industrial unions where bargaining exists for whoever happens to work in a plant, in the construction industry, certified unions had control over the labor supply because contracts in the construction industry permit the unions to refer workers and prohibit employers from hiring workers who aren't referred by the union. Well, Senator Wagner proposed this bill, the National Labor Relations Act, so that the government would certify unions for exclusive rights to bargain with employers and, as I just explained, also exclusive rights to supply workers to employers in construction. And in the Senator Wagner's bill included a provision saying that no union could be certified if it discriminated on the basis of race. And this is important because what was going on was not unknown, and nor was it the conventional opinion that you can excuse by saying nobody knew any better. Wagner's bill had this provision in it, and the AFL unions, the construction industry unions, which were whites-only unions, lobbied to have that provision removed. The provision was removed, so the National Labor Relations Act was adopted, permitting the federal government to certify unions that excluded African Americans. Well, all the construction industry unions excluded African Americans. So African Americans, with the blessing of the federal government, were not only prohibited from living in the suburbs that were created in the next 30 years, but they were prohibited from contributing to their construction. And the blue-collar work of federally certified unions was a big contributor to the income gains of the white working class in the post-war boom period that African Americans, to a large extent, weren't able to participate in. So when we wonder why African Americans have lower incomes than whites, we can't exclude the role that the federal government had, and there were many other ways that the federal government did it, but the role that the federal government had in preventing them from taking the best jobs in the country, in the blue-collar workforce, during the boom period. Let me just talk a minute about wealth, okay? Because we all know that it's not just income, but wealth that provides economic security, and it's also a reason why African Americans can't buy homes in middle-class suburbs to the extent that whites can, because they don't have the wealth for down payments. I mentioned before that these homes in the suburbs that were created in World War II and the decade after, 2 decades after, sold for about $90,000 in today's, about twice national median income. The white families, the white working class families who were permitted to buy homes in those suburbs, returning war veterans lived in those suburbs. African Americans who were prohibited from living in those suburbs were renting apartments in urban areas. Today, homes, say in Levittown or in Daly City or in these other suburbs that I described, sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. 4, 5, 6, 7 times national median income. They are unaffordable to working class families of any race today. Middle class families can't buy homes anymore in the suburbs that were created on a segregated basis by the federal government. Well, in the ensuing 2 or 3 generations, from then to now, those white families gained $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in equity in their homes, in wealth. And most American families, if they have any wealth at all, they get it from the equity in their homes. So after the white families who gained this equity, they bequeathed it to their children, what they had spent on their children's college educations or medical emergencies or on taking care of relatives or retirement. They bequeathed it to their children, who then used out those bequests for down payments on homes. African Americans gained none of that wealth. The result is that today, in the United States, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes. You would expect, all other things being equal, if incomes are 60% of white incomes, assets would be 60% of white assets, because you'd think people would save the same rates and you would have a similar economic situation. Well, while African American incomes are 60% of white incomes, African American wealth today is about 7% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between 0.07% of white wealth. 6.0 income ratio, 0.7 wealth ratio. That enormous disparity between the 60% income ratio and the 7% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced throughout much of the 20th century.
The question is, can Richard talk for a few minutes about the practice of really blockbusting, right, and changing the demographics of the community dramatically? And the second part of that was that the prices that the African Americans paid for those homes when they came into the neighborhood after blockbusting was always much higher than similarly situated whites were paying in other neighborhoods, or than the whites had received for those homes when they sold. So, typical raisin in the sun, story, right?
Right. It is the raisin in the sun story. Yeah, this happened frequently. Because African Americans were so discriminated against in the private market as well as by government, they had a much more restricted housing supply than whites did, and their neighborhoods were much more overcrowded. The incomes in African American neighborhoods were typically varied. There were many quite wealthy people, or at least upper middle class people, living in African American neighborhoods because they couldn't buy anywhere else. Well, if a white homeowner wanted to sell a home, his or her home, his home in those days, in a neighborhood, say that was near an African American neighborhood, it would be to the homeowner's advantage to sell to an African American, because the African American was willing to pay much more for the home than a white would be willing to pay. Simple laws of supply and demand. Even if the home was, and that's why there were all these incidents of, and we didn't talk much about this, all these incidents of violence when African Americans bought a home in a neighborhood. I mentioned the Louisville case. This was a decorated Navy veteran who was higher social status than most of the white people in the neighborhood that he was buying into, and this was typically the case. And there was violence to try to evict them, or as in the case of Raisin in the Sun, attempts of homeowners associations to buy the home back from the African American, or to sue the African American for violating the restrictive covenant. This, by the way, belied the notion that property values decline when African Americans moved into a neighborhood, and the FHA had adequate research demonstrating the contrary, that property values increased when African Americans moved into a neighborhood because they were willing to pay more for housing than whites were willing to pay for similar housing. Well, I mentioned before Wallace Stegner and Palo Alto. Well, in 1954, a white family sold a home in East Palo Alto, just part of Palo Alto, to an African American family. Within 6 months, real estate agents then began going door to door to persuade white families that the neighborhood was going to become a slum, and that they should sell immediately, and the real estate agents were able to buy these homes, speculators were able to buy these homes at far less than their market value, and then resell them to African Americans at far more than their market value. And this goes to the de jure nature of this system, by talking about state licensed real estate agents. The president of the California Real Estate Association set up an office in Palo Alto immediately after this black homeowner bought a home there, put ads in San Francisco newspapers with headlines like "Colored Buyers, homes available in Palo Alto," and within 6 months, as you say, the neighborhood had been flipped from a white middle-class neighborhood to an African middle-class neighborhood. But because, again, African Americans had such restricted housing supply, and because they couldn't get the kinds of FHA mortgages that whites could get, and they had to pay more for their housing, and they paid higher prices in the first place, frequently they had to double up. They had to rent out part of their homes. The average economic status of the neighborhood began to decline, and it did become a slum. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. But this happened again all over the country.
And because they couldn't get mortgages, they also often had to buy essentially on installment contracts. So if you missed one payment, you lost everything, right? Other questions, comments? Over here. Yes. Can you repeat the question?
The question was, has this research changed my view of education reform? And I guess the answer is no, because I was never in favor of the current fad of education reform and wrote extensively about as I said at the very beginning, my view, and I think it's well supported by research, is that the primary cause of the achievement gap, which is what education reform is trying to solve, is not the quality of schools, but the social and economic conditions that children come to school with. And this research stemmed from my conviction that the fundamental education reform that we have to pursue is the desegregation of neighborhoods. Because unless we desegregate neighborhoods, we can't desegregate schools, and unless we desegregate schools, we can't have the kind of broad distribution of disadvantaged families throughout the population so that they can get the attention that they deserve. So it reinforced my previous views, it didn't change them.
Can I just have a follow-up on that? So my daughter is in 8th grade in New York City, and she lives we live in the Bronx, and almost all of the schools in New York City, right, for applying for high school, if you've ever applied for high school in New York City, it's insane. And I'm in the middle of it right now. And it's the schools in New York City are extremely segregated, and the neighborhoods are segregated, but there's all the kind of, you can apply for schools here and there. And what I found also is that so many schools, even if the school's integrated, they'll find ways to segregate the floors inside schools. They'll have the gifted and talented program on this floor, and that'll be all the white kids. And all the black and Latino kids will be in the regular program on the other floor. So I agree, I think segregation is a huge thing we got to deal with, but I really don't have the faith that even if neighborhoods are integrated, that some folks are going to find ways to keep schools segregated, because we're already doing that. And if we've written about this, I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Well, I'll just say that New York is unique because there's no other city in the country which is as dense as New York. And so other cities can't maintain, and which has both is dense and also has the kind of public transportation system that New York has. So other cities can't have these kinds of citywide choice programs that New York has. So I can't use New York as a model for the kinds of solutions we need to impose. If we desegregated neighborhoods, outside New York, most schools would be neighborhood schools, and the schools would not be segregated if the neighborhoods weren't segregated.
And let me just say, in partial response to that, and in partial response to the fact that there are so many interested people here, the city of New York, as many cities, has to, under the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that was adopted during the Obama administration, to put some definition into the affirmatively furthering requirement of the Fair Housing Act, The city will start its assessment of fair housing. It has to file it sometime in 2019, as do many cities. And one of the things that that assessment of fair housing requires is that the city really draw the connection between schools and housing and health and criminal justice and all that. And that's really going to be on all of us to make sure that those connections get made. So, sorry, editorial.
So you actually just stole part of my question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to ask, after having done the research and sort of connected a lot of the dots around the systemic role that law has played in shaping segregation, are there any sorts of positive developments that you see on the future of ways that governments can integrate or attempt to integrate? And I was going to use a permanently furthering fair housing
Okay,
as
so
one
sorry.
of the ways that we're starting to do that.
Well, I believe, and I make this argument in the book, that, and I said this earlier, so I'm going to repeat it, that until we disabuse ourselves of the notion of de facto segregation, we're not going to be in a position to have the kind of national conversation that's necessary to solve this problem and to remedy the segregation. There are certainly things that we can do, on the margins, and I'm in favor of them, and I can talk a little bit about them, but the major thing we need to do is have a national conversation, and it's beginning. I mean, my book is not the only contributor. I was saying before we started to Randy, and that when I began writing this book, I never thought it would get any attention, because it was 10 years ago after that Supreme Court decision was issued, and we were a post-racial society then, remember? And then Ferguson happened, and all of a sudden we're talking about race again, and we're removing monuments to slavery, and we're having a national conversation. I mean, I hope all of you have read or listened to by now the speech that Mitch Landrieu, the mayor of New Orleans, gave when he removed or presided over the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue in New Orleans. I mean, 2 years ago, we couldn't have imagined in our wildest dreams a white Southern elected politician making a speech like that. So it's true, certainly, that there's a resurgence of, or maybe not a resurgence, just an uncovering of white supremacy that already existed. But there's also a national conversation, which we haven't had for a long, long time, about race and about the possibility of remedying these things. So, should I?
No,
Okay.
no, go ahead.
So, for example, and here's something I think we could do. Short of the policies that you're asking me for, because I think we're not ready for them yet. I can talk about some of them, but in the course of writing this book, I examined every commonly used American history textbook in American high schools to see how they dealt with this history. Because, as I say, it's been forgotten. It wasn't unknown. And I'll give you an example. The most commonly used American history textbook of those that I examined, and I think I examined all the commonly used ones, something called The Americans. It's 1,200 pages of the kids have to carry around in their backpacks, American history. There's one paragraph in this 1,200 pages with the subhead Segregation in the North. And there's one sentence in that paragraph about housing. And that sentence reads as follows. In the North, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated housing. The editor who was looking for passive voice constructions must have fallen asleep when he came across that paragraph. No discussion of who did the forcing. African Americans woke up one day, they looked out the window, and they said, "We're a segregated neighborhood." Well, that's mendacious. That's criminal. And if we don't do a better job of teaching the next generation the history that they should know and that we should have known, they're going to do as poor a job of developing the kinds of remedies that you're asking for as our generation has done. So the first thing I think I urge everybody to do is go to the principals of your schools and the PTAs and the school boards if you're living in a smaller community in New York City, and demand that an accurate history of this period be taught so that we can begin remedies. Now, should I give them my wild remedy?
Go for it.
All right. If we had a national conversation and policy elites, educated people understood the unconstitutional nature of our residential boundaries, understood that it's as unconstitutional, as I say, as school segregation was in 1954, here's something they might do. Congress might pass a law. I know you're going to think I'm crazy. I am. It's absurd
Just
because,
there,
because we
right?
don't have this national conversation yet. But Congress could pass a law to describe, the subdivisions like Levittown or Daly City. That's where houses sold for $90,000, $100,000 in today's dollars. New York City is the New York metropolitan area is about 12% African American. Levittown is still only about 2% African American. So there's a 10% problem there. Well, the next homes that come up for Levittown, for sale in Levittown, should be purchased by the federal government for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, whatever the market price is, and resold to qualified African Americans for $100,000. That would be a constitutionally viable remedy in light of the history of de jure segregation. But it's not anything that we could consider now because we think it's all de facto. Now, so far as short-term things, lots of things we can do now. And I'm sure that Vicki knows much more about, because I'm not a housing expert. This is a book of history, but there are lots of things we can do now. We have, we have 3 big programs in that the federal government runs in the housing field. The biggest by far is a subsidy to middle-class homeowners of single-family homes. It's the mortgage interest deduction. Sort of a medium from my crazy radical idea to practical things. A medium proposal was made by a professor about 25 years ago at North Carolina University, and he proposed that suburbs that don't take steps as in line with the affirmatively furthering fair housing provision of the Fair Housing Act, don't take steps to integrate, to provide to a fair share of the housing in their community of low and moderate income families. I would go farther and say because of this constitutional history that don't have a fair share of the minority populations, that those suburbs should have their mortgage interest deductions placed in escrow until they adopt those kinds of zoning laws and take the steps to comply with the Fair Housing Act. So that would be one thing. Short of that, we have 2 federal programs that subsidize housing for low-income families, mostly minority families. One, I'm sure many of you heard of, the Section 8 housing voucher program that provides a subsidy to families, low-income families, that they pay no more than 30% of their income in rents, up to the average rent in a community, or median rent in a community. And that program reinforces segregation today because the median rent in the community is too low to rent in a middle-class community, in a high-opportunity community, and it's actually too high to rent in a segregated community, and so landlords exploit the program by charging more than the market really requires. We could very easily redesign that program, and the Obama administration, its very last month, proposed a rule to redesign that program, or adopted the rule. It proposed it long before and adopted the rule, saying that the subsidies in the Section 8 voucher program and in a large number of metropolitan areas should be adjusted so that they're higher if a family rents in an integrated community and lower if it rents in a segregated community. The Trump administration has said it won't enforce that rule and has forbidden housing agencies from doing it. But that would be a simple reform. The other big program is the low-income housing tax credit, which is a similar program, also reinforces segregation, because most low-income tax credit developments, which are subsidies to developers to build housing for low-income families, most of those are placed in already segregated communities, because developers would rather build where the land is cheaper, and they'd rather not face any community opposition, and they'd rather build a development where they can put signs in the window that people who are walking by can see, saying apartments for rent. That program could easily be redesigned so that a priority is given for building low-income housing tax credit programs in high-opportunity neighborhoods. So there are things we can do, both immediate and ridiculous, and the ridiculous ones become possible the more we understand the history. Right. The question was enforce the requirement that every community in New Jersey have its fair share of low and moderate income housing. But this was 30 years ago or so, but it wasn't enforced until about, I don't know, 5 years ago, was it? Maybe a little bit
Not
more.
that.
Maybe, well,
It's only been really,
couple of years, a couple of years ago, because for most of the period since the decision was handed down, municipalities were permitted to buy out of their obligation by paying other municipalities to take the low-income housing. So it simply perpetuated segregation. But it's now being enforced, and there's some hopeful results of it. Douglas Massey has written a book called Climbing Mount Laurel about a successful project in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, that I recommend to you as an example of what could be done.
and about 130 municipalities in New Jersey have entered into settlement agreements and are actually finally building some of that housing. And it wasn't just the RCAs, right, but also the fact that the state government kept undermining the decision through the work of COA.